Moonlight took on the color of cold metal, and it lay across the bywater road like a blade laid to rest. Frodo slept with the cloak about his knees, the warmth of his hearth still in his bones, and the small forbidden weight at his finger felt heavier for reasons he could not name. The night smelled of damp grass and old smoke, of pipeweed, and the leaning comfort of hedgerows. Then a sound cleft that sleep, the trampling of a horse and the high, terrible keening of a rider. Frodo woke with the taste of ash in his mouth, and something moved beneath his cloak, quick and bright as lightning. A stranger stepped from the shadow of a hedge, and his claws flashed before Frodo could speak. They were not ornaments, nor mere knives. They were long, silver as fresh-forged steel, and they drew the moonlight to themselves as if it hungered. The rider, black-mantled and hollow-eyed, reared horse and shrieked, the cry like frost over a window-pane. The claws bit at leather and chain, a horse tossed its head and skittered, and the rider stumbled where no mortal hand could have so swiftly undone him. There was no shriek of flesh, no spray of ruin. The work was quick and bloody in the sense that evil was ended and the night swallowed the rest. Frodo sat half up, very small beneath the stranger's breadth. He had not seen the man before. He had seen many folk in the market and at festivals, but none moved like this one. He moved like a living blade, all coiled muscle and old habit, and his face, when Frodo found courage to look, was worn as a weathered helm, handsomely scarred in places that told of long campaigns. He spoke little. His voice was low and rough as riverbed stones. He touched Frodo where the hobbit's arm had brushed against a thorn during his flight, and the touch brought warmth like the first generous draught from a hearth after a long, cold day. The sting that had made Frodo suck in breath ebbed, and where he had felt bruises, there was only a settling comfort, as though a seam had been mended with unseen thread. The healing was curious and quick. Frodo had known the kindness of Sam, the salve of an old matron, even the whisper of Elrond's folk, but this mending came with a taste upon the tongue that was neither herb nor spell. It hummed against his skin, a present hum that made his heart beat steadier. He could not explain it, and he did not try. He only clutched the small ring at his finger and felt its familiar hum answer the stranger's touch, with a cold, impatient tug. The ring liked to be hidden. It liked the dark of a pocket, the safekeeping of a small, trusting hand. It liked the quiet of hobbit rooms. The stranger's presence was not quiet, and the ring tightened as if annoyed at being disturbed from its long, polite sleep. "You should be quieter," the man said, not unkindly. His breath came like smoke from a pipe, quick and dark. They sent fear. His name, when Frodo learned it, was Logan. He kept his words spare, and each was a stone dropped into a still pool. Frodo asked in that small way which hobbits ask, more questions in looks than in speech, who he was and what he had come for. Logan only studied the road and the dark where the rider had gone, and his eyes remembered things that Frodo could not know, things that had nothing to do with hedgerows and weddings. The riders had fled, but not in confusion. They passed as a wind passes a candle. They left a cold behind them that made the very air shiver. Their scent of rot and iron hung like a promise. But with the stranger there came a new mark upon the night, subtle and terrible. It clung to the road as if a smoke had lain down upon the grass. Frodo felt it in the small hair along his neck. He thought at first it was only the memory of terror. Then he saw Logan's fingers flex, and he knew it was more. The man's skin, when the moon struck it, seemed to close small wounds as if nothing had ever been there. Yet the road remembered the touch of steel. The riders did not forget. Frodo tried to thank the stranger. Habit made him stumble into politeness even then. Logan brushed the attempt away with a look that was not unkind, but not eager to receive such niceties. "You have a long way to go," he said simply. The words were not a promise, but they carried a promise's weight. Frodo felt the ring tug again, a fish at the end of a line. The stranger's eyes flicked toward it, and something like hunger stirred in them. Not the savage hunger of mere greed, but a long, cold curiosity, as if the man had met worse temptations and found them easy. Frodo drew the cloak about his knees, perhaps more to hide than to warm, and said nothing of the things he felt. He was a hobbit, he knew when to hold his tongue. They did not speak much as the dawn drew on. Logan moved with the hush of one who has walked battlefields and seen what men will do for power and pity. He listened to distant bird calls and to the small, steady breath of the sleeping Shire. When the light grew enough to paint the hedges with frost, there came a distant keening that was not the wind. It was the riders anew, returning along a lane as if they had learned of a scent and followed it with the blind insistence of hounds. But their manner had changed. They were careful, thinly patient, like a wolf that smells bones beneath a wall. The stranger's shoulders hardened. He set his blade, a great plain thing, so that the edge caught the early light. The metal sang a low, dangerous note. Frodo found his own courage by degrees. He had held the ring all those months in the dark, through whispers and dreams. It whispered still, but now it was challenged by the presence beside him, as though another voice would have him act with a different will. He looked up at Logan, who bent and met his gaze. The man's face had the look of one who had been spared too often, and so had learned caution. "You must go," he said. The words were plain. Frodo could have answered every doubt with 1,000 careful refusals, but the sight of the riders' black shapes slicing the sky told him otherwise. The world had become larger than his hearth. They moved as dawn spilled open, packing little more than a cloak and a thin rations purse. Neighbors would have said there was no need, that the Shire was strong in its peace. The riders did not ask the advice of neighbors. They asked only for scent and strangeness. As they left the village behind, the hedgerows closed ranks, and the morning mist lifted like a veil. Logan walked beside Frodo with a strange, almost watchful tenderness. When a briar snagged at the hobbit's sleeve, the man's hand brushed it away. When Frodo stumbled at an unseen rut, Logan's fingers were at his elbow before he could fall. Each small kindness rooted in something older than pity. The riders took up their pursuit in a manner that told of dread rather than haste. They could not wholly be banished by a single man's blade, nor by the stubborn hearth-fire of a hobbit. They were patience and persistence wrapped in a shadow. They were also, it seemed, puzzled. They had come to the Shire for a thing that should have smoked of quiet and simple greed. Now there was a new scent on the road, a scent that did not belong to the land, nor to the hobbits. It was the aura of one who would not die easily, and the Nazgul, wherever they were, felt it as a wrongness, as the knowledge of an unsettled thing. That wrongness irritated them. They searched for its center, and they found it not upon the road, but close at hand. By the time they crested a small hill and looked back, the shape of a great black horse lingered at the skyline, then melted away. The riders had not dared close yet. They lingered to listen. Logan squinted down into the valley where the world opened into fields. He smelled them as a hound smells the ground. "They will not lose it easily," he said. Frodo clutched the ring beneath his robes and felt its cold, eager pulse as if it had another will of its own. He had accepted a companion he scarcely understood. He had accepted, with his small, fearful heart, the protection of a man whose blood seemed not to obey death in the way that common men's blood had to. The bargain between them was not spoken of in long speeches. It lay in the steady pace that Logan set, in the way he matched Frodo's short hobbit stride with a patience born of many marches. It lay in the way the man's claws gleamed a warning in the same rhythm as a heartbeat, and in the manner with which Frodo hid the ring when riders' cries rolled over the pastures like distant thunder. Both of them felt the tug toward an aim older than themselves. It was not merely to flee. It was to begin a path that would lead away from Bywater into a world that had never before felt so close to a hobbit's doorstep. Logan's jaw tightened. The road ahead was long, and the shadows at its ends were sharp. They stepped down between the hedges and onto the road proper. Behind them, the quiet of the Shire gathered itself up like a garment, ready to be put aside. Before them, the way ran eastward, toward places that bore the knowledge of darker things. Frodo's footfalls were small and quick. Logan's stride devoured ground. The riders would find them, that was certain. What was not certain was how a man who could not die would change the angle of a fate that had already begun to bend. Frodo held fast to the ring and to the hope that the stranger at his side would be more blessing than bane. They walked on, and each step forward was both a beginning and a promise of peril, yet to be tested. On the road, the air tasted of iron and pine. The stranger's boots made no hollow sound in the wet ruts. Even when he paused to stare into the dark, he seemed to lean into it as if darkness were something to be tested rather than feared. Men and hobbits walked around him with a careful politeness that was almost rude, the sort that keeps hands far from sheaths and questions short. They called him by many names at first, each softer than the next, until only one held: Logan. It stuck like grit in a shoe. Wherever he slept, he left a ring of whispers, tales at first, then stories, then a kind of half-believed rumor that threaded village to village: a man who will not die. That rumor changed how the road met the world. Riders slid their mounts aside. Dogs refused his shadow. Women at farmhouse doors let him pass with a silence that was not welcome, yet not truly afraid. In the inns, the ale slowed when he took a table, and the hearth's laughter thinned to listening. Children, after an initial thrill at seeing the long dark hair and the hard smile, learned to fold their play away when he let his fingers rest near the leather of his forearms. These were small things, and true, they altered a road, like a fallen boulder alters a stream. Only those who cross it see the ripples. It altered the ring's music as well. The One Ring had learned the cadence of fear, the sweet ache of secret hope, the small, bright stones of envy. Frodo's ring sang for him in low weavings, visions of power, of being more, of never needing to flee again. But beside Logan, its voice changed its tune, as an instrument sounds different near another instrument. The ring found in him no rich courtly hunger, no careful counting of advantage. It listened to something roar. It tasted a hunger of muscle and unspoken afternights. So it tried a different charm. Instead of coaxing lordship, it sharpened into promise. It baited with the scent of dominance, with the possibility that a hand like his could do deeds that time would remember not for rule, but for the end of foes. It whispered not of crowns, but of finality, where the ring spoke to Frodo in honeyed syllables, subtle, seductive, patient. It spoke to Logan in short, metallic clicks, like a blade rapping stones. To Logan, the voice was not a mother or a mirror. It was a challenge, a thing that tested whether the hunger in his chest would bend toward possession or toward protective rage. Frodo noticed less of this, for the ring's insistence moved like a tide he had already learned to avoid. Logan heard the edges, his jaw tightened, when the voice coaxed him with battles he could end. He would sit under a crooked oak, and the whispers would wind around the stars. He would answer them with the slow, almost bored murmurs of a man unused to bargaining. He was not tempted by the ring with visions of dominion, but it tempted him by offering violence as solution. That was a peril of its own sort, so the road became a measure of what choices do to men. A troop of bandits tested the wagon train near the brown fields. They fancied the easy prey of hobbits and merchants, and they advanced like whispers through grass. Logan's claws first showed themselves where a hawk's silhouette only ought to be. They were not the shining talons songs spoke of, but narrow, bright things driven from his own flesh. Steel and shadow parted. One bandit fell silent with a look of surprise. Another dropped his knife as if the world had rearranged its gravity. The ring watched. It pulsed faintly on Frodo's finger, and in that tiny glow could be heard a small, sharp voice. To the bandits it said in thought like velvet, "Take, keep." To Logan it said, "Cut, end." When the road smelled of the spilled ale and the breath of frightened horses, the choice was made in a glance. Logan did what he had always done. He took the threat upon himself, not to own the road, but to end its claim. The last homely house waited for them at the road's end like a patient chord. It came upon them not as surprise, but as an ease the mountains breathed and the world smoothed. Rivendell's light fell like old music through leaves. Water ran with a sound of long stories, and the air tasted of bread made before winter. There were greens like silk and stairways like poems. Within its rooms, the echoes listened. Old hands touched the hobbit's cloak and the wizard's hat with equal tenderness, yet when Logan stood beneath the arch, the melody bent for him too. Gandalf looked at Logan with a face that held deep gratitude and an even deeper caution. The gratitude was the kind that knows what a single strong shield can buy. A night of peace, a man spared, a life kept on a narrow road. The caution was quieter. It was the kind of thing that creases the brow of wise folk, the sound a blade makes when it is tested against an old whetstone, necessary, watchful, and a little sad. The council that followed drew threads of conversation around that simple, dangerous fact. Elrond spoke first, his voice like a slow bell, and each sentence carried the weight of an old prudence. He asked not whether Logan could fight, everyone had seen that, but whether a living weapon could be trusted to walk alongside a hobbit who carried such a burden. Aragorn did not ask such questions in riddles. He spoke of roads longer than they yet knew and of the value of a blade at the right shoulder. Legolas watched Logan as if he might be a shadow of the forest, and there was in the archer's regard a coolness that was not dislike, but an appraisal. Boromir listened with a narrower hunger. He had eyes that measured strangeness as advantage, and to him Logan's presence rang like an uncut gem. He named plainly what many feared to voice. If you have such a man among you, why not use him to claim that which all desire? Therein lay the council's sharpest needle. Gandalf answered with his old level words. He thanked Logan for the lives kept along the way, and his voice folded around the man as if to underline the debt owed. Yet he also warned that weapons do not wear souls lightly. A blade in the hand of a faithful friend can become a chain on the shape of a path. A loyal protector, once cast into the long dark of another's quest, binds himself to the road as surely as any oath-maker binds his name. The wizard's eyes caught Logan's in that dim light, and for a heartbeat the centuries seemed to listen. Logan's reply was not sermon or boasting. He chose instead to show what his words could not. He put his hand upon the table where Frodo's knuckles lay white with worry, and he flattened his palm there with a force that was gentle and absolute. Frodo felt the warmth, or the promise of warmth, and he felt something like trust take a small, trembling step forward. They argued, not of facts, but of futures. To bring Logan was to invite a living blade into the Fellowship, and no blade can be unmade once its edge is set against a path. Elrond asked if any could bind such a soul and keep it whole. Gandalf said that bonds had power, but power must be kept with mercy and watchfulness. He spoke of oaths that had been taken in other ages, of paths that unmade heroes and remade them. Aragorn's voice rounded the caution with a soldier's plain necessity. We will need more than courage. We will need hands that will not fail and will not turn. He did not mean the ring-turning. He meant the blunt doggedness of men who will stand when others fall. Logan offered no grand words. He sat long, then spoke slowly, each syllable like a tightened cord. "I don't want the ring," he said. The speech was rough as if pulled out through gravel, but true. "I don't want power. I want the end of the ones who hunt small folk. I will go with the square of your shadow, with the hobbit. I will put my hands between him and the world." There was in that short confession no saintly glow and no tender speech. There was a willingness to endure, and that sufficed for a kind of covenant. It is the small pacts, made in iron tones under warm lamps, that most often cleave a life to a road. So the Fellowship made room for the living weapon. They named him not for songs, but for deed, Logan of the road and of the long nights. An elven stitch bound him with words of old, an oath smile passed between Frodo and him, like a small candle set between two hands. Gandalf's gaze sharpened then into a promise of its own. He would watch. He would not trust blindly, but he would trust purpose while keeping its edges well-tempered. The choice was not easy, and no one pretended otherwise. It was made in whispers and in sure, cold glances. It was made in the shifting light where the house leans toward the water, in a room that knows how to welcome and how to beware. They laid plans to leave, and beneath Rivendell's arch the air readied itself for the departures of many kinds. The decision to bind Logan to Frodo's path altered the map. It was not a chain, not a shackle, but something that tightened the knot of fate until it could not be simply undone. Even as laughter rose in a distant hall and old stories folded over new, the ring pulsed like a small storm in the hobbit's hand. It listened to the new sound of the Fellowship's tread. It heard a man's stride beside the trembling one who bore the small, terrible gold. It tested again. The whisper, now, moved with a new slyness, less about thrilling conquests, more about the calculus of protection turning inward. It offered Logan not lordship, but ends. It offered him finality at the point of a blade. Logan felt it as a cold wind travels through an open wound. He did not flinch. He wrapped his fingers around the hilt of a hope that was a promise, not an ownership. Frodo looked up, and the hobbit's small face folded with the strange courage of the unarmored. "If you go with me," he whispered, "I will not ask you to carry my thought for me, just my small feet." Logan's mouth twitched. It was the faintest of smiles, like a blade finding its place in a scabbard. "Then ill keep pace," he said, voice a low thread of iron. Outside the windows of the last homely house, the night settled like an old cloak. Within, plans were whispered, and boots were loosed, and the sound of a soft, long belonging slipped between the pillars. A living weapon had been chosen and bound, and with that choice, the path ahead narrowed, sharpened, and became impossible to unmake. The world beyond Rivendell waited, its roads folded like maps in an unread hand, and the ring hummed in its small, precise way, listening for the steps it might yet corrupt, or the blade that might instead end its dark. When the rain eased and the hush of Weathertop fell over them like a held breath, Logan stood with his back to the black-stained stone and felt the cold that did not belong to weather. The wound the ring had left was not of blade or of bone. It lay under his ribs and under his skin, a hard, small thing that clung like ice. He could feel it when he moved, like a chill in the marrow. The metal sang in his hands, but the sound was not of steel alone. It carried an echo of something old and patient. Frodo crouched against him, small and trembling, the hobbit's face pale as milk and mottled with the dust of the hill. Around them the grasses had been crushed into dark patterns, and high above the ruin the pale stars seemed to shiver. Logan's breath came out uneven, as if he had run farther than his years accounted for. He did not speak much. His voice had been tested, on the slope, and found to be a low, hoarse thing. He listened. Something in the air felt thinner now, as if a shawl of shadow had been pulled back to let the stars peer closer. Frodo's hand found his sleeve and clung. Sam lay a pace away, watchful, sharpening a small knife with a care that looked more like prayer than anything else. They were alive by hair and by cunning, and every nerve in Logan's body knew that those margined seconds were charged. He had never been young by the reckoning of men, and in his native land he had waded through pain and known how wounds knit themselves under his skin. This hurt was different. It did not scab or scar, and it did not take kindly to sleep. At night, when Logan shut his eyes, the cold opened its mouth like a sea, and the taste of iron and old smoke rose in his throat. He saw a ring of black iron set in a hand that was not flesh, but shadow. He saw its eye turn to him and feel something like a lover's hunger. He woke shaking and with his claws close to the surface. The sound of his bones settling was a soft, habitual sermon against the dark. Frodo moved as if he could not quite remember where his feet were. He watched Logan with a growing mixture of gratitude and unease, and the ring across his breast pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of a thing that remembered being used. Logan felt the things tug like a fly upon his skin. Once, when Frodo had laughed for no reason but relief, the laugh struck some hidden gear within the ring, and a cold finger went along Logan's spine. He almost lashed out then, not at Frodo, but at the memory that reached for him. He did not. He had taken a vow, thin as wire and old as winter. It had been spoken in the clutter of the fall, under a sky that had watched too many wars. From the moment the Nazgul clawed at Frodo, and his shadow had answered with claws of his own, Logan's choice had been made and set. The vow bent him like a spear. He who had wandered without oath now found himself bound to a hobbit's breath. The promise hardened in him into something that no blade could shave away. He would not flinch. He would close like a hinge around Frodo's life and not unfasten. It filled him with a steadiness that frightened him more than the cold. He had been a thing of many roads, yet never had he felt so anchored. It was not nobility. He thought it was a simple animal guarding the last of its kind. But there was a thought behind the animalism too, and it carried the iron clarity of purpose. If they were to be hunted to the last hole of the world, he would keep Frodo breathing until he could breathe no more. They moved down from the ruin with the wind at their backs. The land around Weathertop fell away into heath and copse, and the moon measured the way for them in long silver strokes. The roads were scarcely more than faint threads, and at times the hobbit tracks blurred under older prints. The air tasted of damp stone and of a far-off smoke that suggested a wildness. wolves or men that might have been roused by the hill's uproar. Logan walked a little ahead and a little behind in the same stride. He kept his posture open but watchful, the way a wolf pads the circumference of its sleeping. When the ring tugged at Frodo, Logan felt the pull as surely as a beast senses a distant scent, and he would pivot, a blade of shadow ready. At noon, they came upon a small brook that ran clear between tufts of reed. Frodo sat too long by that water and held his palms beneath the stream. He stared into the moving glass and saw his own face like a child's, and for a moment he was young and unburdened. Sam fussed about him, drying his shoes and muttering about folly, and Logan watched the two hobbits with a thin, iron patience. When Frodo rose, he left a smear of water on his tunic and something like a trace of the rings chill on the skin of his wrist. Logan could not pretend not to notice. He reached out and brushed the place with one hand. Heat should have been the answer of flesh to touch, but instead it was as if a cold coin had been pressed to his palm. That night, the stars were fewer and the air more heavy. They sheltered under a stand of beeches, the trunks black as upright bones. Logan made a small fire even though he had little patience for such human comforts, more to make a circle of light than to warm. Frodo slept lightly, one hand upon his breast, and in the smoke of the fire the young face looked hollowed and ancient as anything forged by grief. Logan kept guard and listened to the sounds of the wood. The distant trill of an owl, the careful shifting of small creatures, the sigh of leaves. Beneath that there was a softer, steadier sound, like the slow creak of a ship on a tide. It was the far tread of something that moved by will and not by footfall. As days folded into night and night into hard-edged mornings, the influence upon Logan made itself evident in wayward small things. He would wake with the taste of cold iron on his tongue, although he had eaten no metal. His sleep was broken by flashes of other years, flames that were not hearth-fire, men with faces like flints, a chill wind that carried laughter like bone. He caught himself sometimes reaching for the ring when Frodo put it down to wash his hands, as if the thing had shown him a promise of quiet. Twice he had to restrain his own hand, until Sam's sharp scolding brought him back to common sense. The wound had not made him weak, it had made him tetchy, possessive in a way that had not often visited him. He had to fight the urge to carry Frodo himself, to clasp the hobbit to his wide chest and run until the world drew no more breath, simply to keep the ring sheltered from those who would seek it. Frodo saw the change and felt it like a secondary cold. He did not condemn Logan. He understood in the dim and certain way of one who had been given a great and terrible thing that any hand near the ring could become a battleground. But the hobbit did not like how Logan's eyes would linger on the glint of the metal when the light caught it, the way his jaw tightened, the way he would sometimes stand very still, as if listening to a far-off bell that no other could hear. Where once there had been only gratitude, now sat a shadowed mirror, sympathy folded over worry. Sam watched both of them with a distrust that was as fierce as any sword. He watched Logan with the thrift store caution of a gardener seeing a storm approach, and he watched Frodo with cupfuls of love. Word reached them, as word will in a land alive with feet, of a rider seen on the road to Bree. Two strangers with cloaks too dark and a horse with foam matted at its flank had passed a farmhouse at dusk. The folk who had sighted them shivered in telling and spoke of a chill that lifted out of the road like smoke. Logan listened, and something in him tightened further, as if the wound within him had been pricked anew. He had the skill of discernment that comes from a long life of fight. He knew the signs of measure and motive. The sound of hooves at night could mean many things, but those who spoke did not speak of simple raiders. They spoke of the whisper of iron and of a voice that was not quite human. They could not hide for long. The ways of the world do not bend to a single man's will, even one who would keep a hobbit like a lantern in his palm. The road ahead was a thin thread, and the land around it narrowed like a throat. Logan made the choice that evening, while the sky still held the last leaden blue of day. He would not allow Frodo to be set upon in some sleepy hamlet while strangers set their nets. He would not take him to some shallow refuge where kin and candles would give up the scent to an ancient hunger. He spoke then, and his voice had the low, flat certainty of a man who had been awoken to duty. "We go east," he said, and there was no question in his tone. "We make for the ford, but not by the road the folk take. We'll walk the hidden way through the green tangle. If there's danger, we meet it on our feet." Frodo looked up at him, and for a moment the small face was a map of torn places and of stubborn lanes. Sam put a hand on Frodo's shoulder and sighed. The decision released something in Logan like a held breath. He felt the cold within him gather its edges as if in answer, as if the thing wanted direction and would follow where he pointed. That thought made his jaw ache. He had stumbled into this land as a thing without past or future, a weapon with no cause. Now he shouldered cause like armor. He would carry the promise of this night into the light. He would guard the hobbit until the end of things, flame or water, mountain or abyss. They broke camp at first light. The mist lay flat upon the ground, and their footprints darkened the dew like small declarations. Logan kept close to Frodo, an arm's breadth between them, and when they passed through a stand of elder trees, the wind seemed to find them and circle the group as if testing the air. Somewhere beyond the hills, a raven tore the morning with its voice. The road ahead narrowed, and the trees drew together like hands coming to prayer. Logan felt the thing in his chest, the cold shaped into its final shape, a vow that would not bend. He walked into the green as the world held its breath, and behind him the shadow of Weathertop lay like a closed eyelid. Ahead, the track dwindled and the day grew thin. He had chosen the road, and it would not turn back. The dark beneath Moria held its breath as if the mountain itself listened. Old stones leaned inward like guardians with tired knees. The air tasted of iron and distant rain. It carried the weight of names forgotten and of endings rehearsed until they sounded like truths. In that gravity, the ring no longer spoke only as temptation. It spoke as a promise, soft and absolute, a voice shaped from finality. Logan felt it not as words but as cold pressure against the inside of his skull, a slender hand on the wild knot of his memory. It promised the last mercy, to still the ache that had been his companion for 100 lifetimes, to make every wound mean nothing, to make all ghosts dissolve into a quiet he had been taught to crave. He did what men like him do in the face of such offers. He refused. The refusal came like a snarl and a tightening of the throat. He pulled his hands back into his pockets as if warding off a heat that might singe him if he reached. Denial is a rudimentary blade. It cuts out what tempts, but it does not make the temptation go away. The ring heard it, and it answered with patience. Each time Logan said no, it took a little stitch of himself in payment, not outwardly, no sudden wound, no loss of limb, but an erosion of that quiet magic that had set him apart. Where his body had always been an unmarked rock in storms, now there were slow leaks, small cuts that refused to close, bruises that remembered the shape of pain a touch longer. It began with a nick on the back of his hand, a thin line that bled for a heartbeat and then slowed, like a stream finding new earth. He laughed at it, the sound rough and short, and set his jaw. The fellowship, already frayed by miles of terror, noticed the difference in the nights to come. Aragorn did not say he felt worry he bore it in a weight that made his shoulders square, but heavy. Legolas watched with the quick, unvoiceable assessment of one who could tell a hunter's weakness by the angle of his eyes. Gimli grumbled and spat the way men do when they cannot make sense of what they fear. Frodo felt the change most keenly. The ring's voice had curled around him like a vine. Its promises were sugar-sweet and serpentine. When Logan refused the ring's offer to end pain, Frodo did not cheer. He flinched at the cost. He saw, perhaps with more clarity than others, what a protector tethered to the ring would become. Not merely a shield, but a thing unmoored, paid for by the very life it promised to save. They argued only once, that night over embers. Words were small things, to forbid the world's turning, but they must be spoken. "He is the one blade that can carve a way," Aragorn said. His voice was rough with iron and counsel. "Without him, Frodo will be found, and the shadow will feed." Sam stood by Frodo's side with fists balled and pity on his face, while Merry and Pippin listened like birds watching a storm. Gandalf's eyes met Logan's in the dark, and in that look there was no scolding, only the tired arithmetic of need. The wizard did not move to stop the choice, only to record it, as if writing another line on his memory of what must be risked. So the decision was made, and with it a strange new covenant took shape. They would go to Mordor with Logan at Frodo's side, not because they trusted him wholly, but because trust had become a commodity too rare for the road. They took him because he could stand between the Shireborn hobbit and oblivion. They took him knowing the cost. The moment agreement passed between them, the ring recognized its new instrument. It tested him as a smith weighs temper, and found in him a certain stubbornness that did not bend, but would, instead, cleave. That stubbornness would be its tool. At first the decline was as subtle as frost on the lip of a river. Logan walked the pass, his face set like flint, and his hands betrayed him in small mercies. Where his skin had once knitted like wool, now scabs remained tender for days. A spear's nick left a complaint that lingered. He dozed less soundly. He woke with a taste of iron and the memory of dreams that were not his, dreams of faces that had been erased by time, names that had come back like a tide. He hid it from Frodo by day, but at night the hobbit sometimes rose and found Logan staring at his hands as though counting the cost in knuckles and thin, bright scars. The more Logan denied the ring, the more his recoveries frayed, as if the gift had been an elastic band stretched taut by refusal until it snapped at the smallest strain. It did not give all at once. It unpicked itself in threads. He could still stand at dawn and put one foot before the other. He could still swing his claws like iron and make orcs fall away. But between strikes, he felt his marrow cold, as though the bone remembered a winter and would not forget it. Nights were long with the whispers of the ring. Days were long with the labor of pretending to be whole. Frodo, ever watchful, felt guilt and curiosity braided together. He would sit near Logan when the man slept, trembling not with fear but recognition. "Why?" he asked once, simply, as if asking the sky why it had clouds. "Why stay? Why refuse an end to your ache?" Logan's reply was a low rumble shaped like humor and pain. "Because some pains are fences." He touched the scar along his brow, where once an arrow had tried and failed to claim him. "Because if I take them all down, we might lose the wall between what ought to be and what should never be." The hobbit, who carried a burden that hummed like a wound inside his breast, folded his small hands and decided not to press more. To press would be to demand the impossible from a man who already paid. The road forward became an older thing. The company moved under darkening skies that looked as though someone had scraped the light thin. They met patrols shorn of conscience. They fought in narrow places where a swing could be the last sound. Each skirmish was a ledger. Lives saved, prices tallied. Logan's blades sang. When he was cut, the wound stayed wet a little longer. When he collapsed, it was not the instant death of legend, but the slow fall of a thing exhausted. They learned to carry him a little differently. Aragorn's hands, usually so steady with sword, learned the gentleness that comes from steadier grief. Legolas' arrows flew truer when aimed to buy time rather than kill. Gimli scowled as he took to climbing to places the others could not, because he would not let Logan be found on the ground. In the quiet hour before a dawn not yet born, the Fellowship camped by an old, blackened river. Frodo felt the ring grow heavy on his chain, like a heart looking for purchase. Logan kept watch with his back to the smoke. He watched the others, too, in a way that was more than sentry duty. He watched them as if taking inventory of what were left to lose. The conversation that night was minimal. There was no triumph, only a taut acknowledgement. They would go on, and they would ask more of the man who had come from another world than any man should ask of himself. "You will not forgive it in me," Logan said at last, voice low and rough. The sentence was not exact. The fire flared, and embers leapt, and Frodo felt cold as a stone. He moved closer as if proximity could make forgiveness unnecessary. "I will not ask it," he said. "I will not ask you to be what you were before the world taught you to want an end to your aches." Logan's laugh was a little like wind through broken glass. "Maybe I am what I am," he said. "Maybe I'm only good for chopping down the things that come at you. But I want to choose that. I don't want someone else to have chosen it for me by taking away what hurts." He flexed his fingers, and the faint light showed a bruise that spread like spilled ink under the skin. "This fraying, people will say it's weakness. But maybe the ring thinks it's a tether. Maybe it wants the cost to be etched into me, so I'll bind myself to it." They all looked away at that. Sam's jaw trembled. Aragorn closed his eyes for a long moment and breathed through it. Gandalf, who had read the calculus of fate more often than any of them wished, sighed as a man with no more illusions. "We choose the narrow road," he said, and his voice did not soften. "We choose who will carry the light and who will carry the shadow. We must be watchful for both burdens." As dawn bled into the sky, they packed and shouldered their sorrow. That decision folded into their journey like a new seam, neat and inevitable. Logan took his place at Frodo's side, not as invincibility, but as guardian, who bled slowly. The knowledge of his slow undoing clung to them like a second cloak. Their path would take them through lands where darkness learned to wait, and through gates that had names of iron and old grief. The ring's voice grew patient, and more cunning. It would try again, and in new ways. But for the time being the road moved, and with each step the company bound their fates more closely together. Logan found himself watching Frodo not as a prize nor as a task, but as a small, stubborn light that might yet change the shape of his own ending. The promise of the ring writhed in the spaces between his denials and the slow fray of his healing, and he felt, for the first time in many lives, something like fear that was not personal but urgent and clear, that to refuse might carve him into something others could not recognize, and to accept would hollow him into silence. He set his jaw and walked. The mountains ahead were black, their teeth bared in the first hard light. There was no more argument, there was only motion. Toward Mordor, toward a testing that would not be satisfied with small proofs, toward a moment when the choice would not be a quiet payment, but a voice and a blade, and the honest measure of a life. The last light of the world hung thin and white above the lip of the pit, a brightness like a promise and a threat at once. Frodo stood there, the small shape of him barely more than a shadow against the furnace, his hand trembling where the gold lay upon his finger. A voice older than stone thrummed in the air, not a voice of speech, but a pulling, a whisper that wrapped about the heart and made the knees give. Ash moved like smoke-seen things across the plain, the air tasted of iron and singing metal. The earth itself seemed to lean closer and listen. Logan saw the change in Frodo as one sees a light guttering. For an instant all gentleness left the hobbit, and in its place came a thing of hunger and claim. The ring gilded his mind, and the world became a narrow line, the bright point of that gold round a finger. Sam reached, tearing with cries, but his hands could not find purchase in the sudden glass sheen of the moment. Another shadow leapt, thin hands, desperate and slavering, and Gollum's whisper braided with the ring's pull. The three of them hung between desire and ruin. Between them stepped Logan like a stone cast into a pool, and the ripple was of a different sort. He did not speak a promise or make a bargain. He moved with a dogged, simple intent. He would not let another hand close upon what would unmake. His claws, sudden silver, caught the light and felt like cold truth. He seized at Gollum's reaching wrist and caught Sam's shoulder with the other hand, anchoring where the world tried to pull apart. He pushed, not to take, but to hold, to make a gap through which no other could step. Heat rolled around them with the sound of a vast thing breathing. The ring screamed then, though no throat made the sound. It was a sound that pried at bone and memory. It lashed outward like a flame made of will. It sought to drive the interposers aside, to fling them from their feet with the force of its own unmaking. The ring's last fever flared, and with it came an answering violence upon the living. Logan took the first of that violence as a man might take a blow meant for a child. It struck him not as blade or fist, but as cold that burned, as if every lie the ring had ever fed had turned to needles and thrust into him. The air around him writhed, his skin went tight and hot, and then slack in places where it should not. Old hurts, long healed, unfurled like maps and burned away. Ranks of scar and seam walked backward. The uncanny gift that had mended him at every fracture flamed and fell from him as if it were a cloak discarded. He stood with arms wide to make a wall, and where the ring's will had reached, the man beneath the adamant hardened into only flesh. Sam's voice was a ragged thing at his side, pleading and furious. Frodo's eyes were gone to a glassy brightness. For a heartbeat, he lifted the hand that bore the ring as if to hide the light within the fist. Between the hobbit and the hole, a figure clung and wrestled, small mouths biting, fingers clawing, and the heat took them all like one vast breath. Gollum twisted, fierce and pitiful, his teeth seeking, and Sam struck out blindly with the heel of his hand. Logan held them apart, his grip iron beneath the shudder of their struggles. Then something happened like a breaking, a slip, a cry of triumph, and the ring rolled free. It fell from the hand that had not meant it to fall, and shimmered in the white as though it would not touch shadow. For one terrible second, the whole of Mount Doom, bent to that bright coin desire, surged through the stone and the smoke. A sound went up, a hungering note, and with it a recoil, an answering recoil that no one expected. The ring did not merely plunge into the fire as an object might. It gave one final voice, a long and ancient sound that washed outward and struck at the room, as if to claw its maker back. It was not speech, but the essence of command, the memory of lords and dominions, and the hunger to be master again. That voice of things old sought to cling to flesh and thought, and to carry some fragment of itself into whatever would bear it forward. It lashed at hands, eyes, bones. It ripped at what kept men standing. Logan felt that lash as a thing physical and moral both. Where it struck, he felt the warmth of youth leach from him like color from a washed cloth. Bone did not knit as it had, and the small indignities of age crowded in where his prowess had been. His strength did not fall at once. He found instead a terrible clarity standing bare of the unnatural mend. He saw with an acute and humble sorrow what wars he had been kept from ending by the thing inside him. He had fought without end because his body would answer. Now the body that answered would break as any mortal man might. The thought of smallness came like a cold dawn. The falling ring struck the fire, and the mountain opened its throat to take it, and there was a ripping of sound that left the ears ringing. Gollum protested in a voice that was more animal than man, and in that instant he lost his balance entirely. The two thieves toppled Sam, weak with sobs and fury, reached for them. Frodo, the light leaving his eyes, reached too. Logan, who had not sought to possess, pushed with the last of his unusual vigor. He shoved Sam clear and caught at Gollum's scrabbling shoulder, not to clutch the ring, but to see that the small ring-bearers were not flung into the teeth of the thing that had made kings of many. Hands met slipperiness and flame. The ring tumbled and shrank into the fire's hungry mouth. For the briefest of breaths, the mountain seemed to sing as if it had been waiting for this. The last cry of the ring was a thing of fury and of old sorrow, thrown back upon itself into the consuming. The brightness collapsed, and the smoke turned inward. Where it touched, there came a recoil as well a recoil that struck back at those who had stood near enough to it, who had kept others from reaching. Logan flinched when that recoil passed through him, not because it burned, but because it made him suddenly small in a way he had not been since boyhood. His muscles felt like they belonged to a stranger. A neatness he had once known, an ease of bone and tendon, left him like a ship leaving harbor. He felt aches he had not imagined, dim, quiet heartbreaks of injury that had once healed in a day, now wrote themselves into him as if they were to stay. He found a length of hair gone from his temples. He felt the old roughness in his hands deepen into something like fragility. Around him others sagged and wept, and the smoke rained ash and dust like a benediction. Frodo folded at last into himself, the storm of the ring spent and the last of its commands gone. He lay very small upon the black ground, skin gray, breath shallow, but not broken. Sam fell upon him, a tangle of arms and fierce noises, and Gollum, stripped at last of his secret hope, crawled and whimpered, and was gone into the fire he had loved. The mountain gave one final shudder and then sank back upon itself, done with that single great work. When the white light hissed down and the black smoke thinned, the world felt older. It felt as if a long bruise had been set and left to seam over. Men and things moved awkwardly within it. Men who had seen wonders looked like men who had been upended. Elendil's kin and the soldiers who had stood watch at the borders felt as if a hand had smoothed their spines. None of them could know in fullness the price just paid by the one who had stood between. They would praise, of course, and tell tales, and make a myth where once there had been only human stubbornness, but myth would not name every small thing that had been surrendered. Logan rose slowly, testing weight upon knees that answered with a new candor. He ran fingers along scars that had, until that moment, been mere marks and not history. Each was a chapter now, a cost exacted in rawness and in the loss of what had kept him from aging. He looked at Frodo and saw in the hobbit's face a map of the end of their road, victory, and an emptiness in which joy could not yet live. Frodo's eyes opened and found him with the strange hobbit-hollow stare of one who has walked outside his place and returned. Sam, the sound of his voice raw and trembling, thanked him in the old language of gratitude that is more like prayer than words. Logan, who had been called by many names and bound to fewer promises, only shook his head. There were no deeds in his tongue that could balance what had been lost. He had not come seeking glory, and would not let himself be lauded when the ledger had been paid. He had given up the thing that made him eternal, and that counted for him more than any reward. A breeze moved through the ruined lip of the pit and carried with it the smell of rain to come. Dust settled upon hair and cloak like slow snow. Frodo tried to sit and failed. Sam steadied him with stubborn, loving strength. Around them, men and minor folk took stock, patched and tended. Voices rose to order and to comfort. The world would not stop working because one great thing had been ended. It would clean itself and begin again. Logan turned his back to the pit. He felt every smallness, every ache. He felt the trembling of hands that could no longer trust the miracle that had carried them through so many fights. Yet the face he saw in the hardened light of the mountain did not look like defeat. It looked like beginning. He walked toward the path that led down, the slope that would take them back to Greenlands, and the slow, small life he had once mocked. Each step was an adaptation, an acknowledgement of fragility, and yet it carried in it the steadiness of a choice. Behind him, Frodo and Sam gathered themselves and rose with the help of those who would not leave them. The wrecked pieces of the world would be mended in ways that no ring could command. As he moved, Logan glanced back once more at the smoking throat of Mount Doom. The air shimmered where the fire had closed, and the mountain seemed to breathe its last and then settle. He did not know whether remorse would find him, nor if regret would be his steady companion. He did know this. Whatever life he now owned would be lived without the quick solace of quick recovery. He would bruise, heal, and carry the marks, as all men do. He would have to learn what it meant to be small. His pace did not hasten nor slacken. He stepped down into the gray world below and into the moving crowd of returning souls. The decision lay before him like the road he chose, to vanish into the shadow of a small house by Bywater, perhaps, or to walk strange new roads in the world he had saved. He had no certainty beyond the one sharp truth that cut through the smoke. He had paid the cost and chosen to pay it. In his chest, the beat was not the endless rhythm that had once been a promise of continued violence. It was a human pulse, steady and fragile, and he felt it with a clarity that was its own kind of grace. He took one more step and then another, and the path before him opened its plain, wide and uncertain, as if to say that the smallest of lives might now be held with honor.